My name's Louisa Mamooney. As host of today's webinar, I'll acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are all meeting, and I'm on Gadigal Wangal land. And wherever you may be joining us from today, I acknowledge the traditional elders, past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal people who are joining us today. The community of policy professionals is for New South Wales public sector employees working in any policy-related role. It provides opportunities for policy professionals to share knowledge, policy best practice, and hear from people within or outside of government who can share case studies, policy initiatives, lessons learned, and useful policy resources and tools. Today's webinar is on Policy in Practice, a Minister's Perspective, with the Honourable James Griffin, Minister for Environment and Heritage. In New South Wales, our ministers have a significant impact in policy making, responding and discussing policy issues and setting the policy agenda. And in today's webinar, we get to talk directly to one of our ministers about the policy process and what he sees as good policy development and implementation, as well as observations from his role as Minister for Environment and Heritage. For all our discussion in the policy community of practice about policy content, process, and practice and implementation, the role of the minister is probably not as understood as well as it should be, even though we spend a lot of time thinking about it and writing briefs and correspondence and all sorts of advice for ministers. And we know it's really important, but let's find out more about the critical decision-making stage and some of the less visible stages of the policy cycle, including the role of the minister in identifying issues or agenda setting, in considering policy options, in forming advocacy coalitions to address an issue, in thought leadership, in stakeholder engagement, and having a say in how policy is implemented. And just to remind you that this is an apolitical event. With the election coming up next year, we've been asked to keep this in mind and not focus on aspects that are related directly to the election, including election commitments or statements. But just to introduce Minister James Griffin, he is member for Manly in New South Wales in the Legislative Assembly and has represented Manly since April 2017. And in December 2021, James was appointed Minister for Environment and Heritage in the Perrottet Government. The Minister is a conservationist committed to protecting nature and rehabilitating ecosystems and land and the ocean. He wants to put Aboriginal land and ocean management techniques front and centre and is committed to protecting and celebrating our heritage. Prior to being appointed a Minister, James was Parliamentary Secretary for the Environment, Veterans and Health, and he was part of the Legislative Assembly Committee on Environment and Planning, and he's also the former chair of the Legislation Review Committee. Outside of work, and maybe we'll get to hear more about this, running helps him stay sane, and as do his wife, Alyssa, and their two children, Ted and Grace. So thank you, Minister, for joining us today. I'll pass over to you now to tell us more about your perceptions of policy, given your current role, and then this will be followed by a question and answer session. And I'll pop a note in the chat when we get to that stage, so our audience members know what to do. But hello and welcome.
Thanks, Louisa. And it's great to be joining you and everybody else on this morning, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. And I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of land on which we are all zooming in from today. And thank you. As you said, I've been the member for Manly since 2017 and have had the enormous privilege of being the Minister for Environment and Heritage for nearly a year now. And it's been a really wonderful opportunity to make some positive change in a really important portfolio area, which is close to my heart. But I think you, in your introduction, touched on something which sets a good backdrop for our discussion today, and that is, I think, the different role that a Member of Parliament has and the intersection that a Member of Parliament has with policy creation or review over the lifetime as being an MP, and that sort There we go. Somehow
Yes.
got muted. There. As I was saying, I think an interesting intersection of how you engage with policy begins when you start as an MP, whether you're working on committees with other members of Parliament and reviewing the work of or the prospective work of government, right through to then being a parliamentary secretary, which is in other jurisdictions called an assistant minister. And through that, you also get exposure to the way in which policy is constructed and created, and typically assisting the relevant minister where that intersects generally with stakeholder groups and different communities, and then ultimately becoming the minister, whereby, from my perspective, you are often at the pointy end of the decisions and the outcomes that have been driven from a bottom up, but also how do you take a long-term visionary view that sometimes can be a courageous one in some, as some people would see it, through to really business as usual decisions when it comes to policy. I remember and recall vividly, shortly after being sworn in, getting briefings from the department, and I tallied all that up, and there were 26.5 hours worth of briefings from the Environment and Heritage Group to try and provide some context into some of the really deep, challenging policy issues that we have, the likes of which that you've been working on, and the good work being done with the biodiversity offset scheme, which is a challenging area. It's somewhat complex, and there are many moving parts to it. But equally, some of the opportunities in the discussions when it comes to formulating policy that don't necessarily hinge on a long period of work, but maybe come about as a result of a point in time. And I think particularly with the environment had on recently, the challenges with soft plastic recycling and the fact that that was driven by external forces has then prompted us, as from a government perspective, to think a little bit more, work a little bit harder, and understand, using a point in time, can we be a catalyst for change, and what policy and how do we have to be nimble in working to deal with that particular issue. But at the end of the day, I think from a personal perspective, when you become minister, it's still about remaining true to yourself. And for me, that meant going back and revisiting my inaugural speech in Parliament, because that's really where you set out your values and your foundations in terms of how you will take on this role, whether it's representing your constituency or then how you apply those values and that outlook into a portfolio. So my foundation values were around integrity, they're around passion for the job, and ultimately around delivering results. And I think when you put yourself in the shoes of the citizen, sometimes government can seem so big and so large that they are seeking for tangible, real examples of where government has delivered policy that has benefited and impacted their lives for the better. And that's really been a cornerstone of the work that I've been doing. And then also, I think the style that each different minister takes to their role, mine has been one of optimism. I think that politics is a challenging place at the best of times, and the community, given the challenges that we've got in every field of life, are looking for some leadership and some optimism. And that's not optimism grounded in naivety or putting your head in the sand for the difficult issues, but certainly optimism around what great minds that we have in the public service are bringing to the table to affect real change and make people's lives better. And that's one thing that I've been incredibly proud of. I put up a LinkedIn post only last night saying, look, he was 12 months in the job. I've outlined a couple of things in there that made me particularly proud, but I've also called out that none of this would have been possible without the outstanding public servants who have really put passion and given good thought and consideration to some good policy outcomes.
Thank you. And yes, we're all, as part of the policy community of practice, very passionate about those outcomes and across the sector. So I'm getting the sense that you would now like to hear from us in terms of some questions for you. So I will put a note in the chat, but look, it's not very often that we get to speak directly with a minister, and it's actually, you know, always the highlight of our careers to be able to do that. But I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit more about a day in the life of you. And I know probably one day is not enough to get a full sense, but what is the average day like for you? You know, we're really, I guess, interested to find out about all the different things and maybe competing pressures that you're having to deal with.
Yeah. It's you can kind of break them up into three different sections. One is the constant role of an MP, which is in addition to your ministerial activities, and that is servicing your electorate. And there is often a time pressure in terms of the need and the work that you have to put into solving what are often very micro localized issues, but you can never lose sight of the fact that you need to service your electorate. And so some of the time is spent in the electorate office, dealing with constituent issues in whatever form they may come, going out and meeting with local groups and communities, and looking after your local community. The second would be when Parliament is sitting, and that's really making sure that the passage of bills are working and being delivered, that legislation is flowing effectively, that contributions to debate are being done, and really making sure that our policy agenda is making its way through the legislative process to ultimately get to an outcome where it is passed and we get ascension of the bill. That then finishes with, from time to time, an executive council meeting where two ministers will head to Government House to meet with the governor to discuss the legislation that's being put in front of the governor for her approval, which really sees the culmination of our collective hard work, because that regulation or that policy becomes law. So you've got the parliamentary and legislative work, and then finally is the ministerial work, which is broken up typically into getting out in the field to really get a ground truth perspective on how the policies and reforms that we are discussing are being either received or seeking feedback from the communities that they'll directly impact. And then that's either done by getting out and really, you know, meeting with community groups, with residents, with you name it, or then having those different stakeholder groups, lobby groups, peak bodies come and meet at 52 Martin Place. You've then also got the media element. So how are you dealing with them? How are we communicating what we're doing effectively and responding to questions that they may have? And then there is making sure that there's a very well functioning relationship with the executive leadership of the relevant department. And in my case, that's EHG, Environment Heritage Group, and making sure that we're having a really good frequency of meetings that are achieving good outcomes. So you can then imagine that stacked as a day in a diary, and then the added pressure of external events that you're constantly invited to come and speak at and be involved with. But if you consider that the pressure of all of that on your time is actually a privilege, because you know you're out there speaking to hundreds of people of a week, absorbing all of this information, and then trying to share the important valuable parts of that internally to help then inform some of the policy discussions and work that's going on. So it can be a very effective two-way street to get formal feedback from stakeholders, but also informal discussions and chats with community groups. And then when you guys are sending up the brief, it then helps inform and colour some of those discussions and the reading that's going on.
That sounds mind-boggling. And later we will ask how you stay sane with all of that going on. But I guess one of the questions that comes to my mind is to given all of that, and we had a question from Kate, and I might ask her to come on and ask a question about, how can we then best support, so sorry, Kate, I don't want to steal your thunder.
No, that's basically my question. I guess it's based on your recent experiences. We're going to have an election coming up soon. Do you have any recommendations about how we can assist new ministers to get up to speed without, spending 30 hours on new proposals?
Yep. So that's a great question, and I think that on reflection, what I really benefited from was, and also I guess think of the human aspect of this. Everybody learns differently. For some, it's done best by reading copious amounts of documents and reports. For others, it might be a discussion. For others, it might be seeing and observing and doing. So for me, it was a mixture of all of that. Some of the concepts, particularly in environment space, are very complex and take years of expert insight and work to get your head around. But the expectation of the minister is to be up on that very quickly. There is, of course, a period of time where you can rightly say, well, look, I'm not entirely across that. But I think a mixture of a very well documented incoming minister folder, which the team produced, was great. And even in doing that, what was really important was the tabs and the headings, because that then gave it an insight into how we're breaking up different policy issues and challenges in terms of importance and what headings are they under. And then it was really taking one step back and having a macro look at where we as a state sit in terms of the challenges we're trying to achieve in that particular portfolio, and how that stacked up against other states, and also a global perspective on some of the challenges that we're experiencing. So taking one step back, macro overlay of what's happening, and then starting to get into basically the work that has been done, and then the ideas looking forward in how we might solve some of these challenges and problems. And I think the positioning and the contextualizing of all that doesn't need to be done in a way of saying we have all the answers and here are some choices for you. It can be actually to say this is a problem or a challenge that we don't have a fix for, but here are some perspectives and some views on how we might go about challenging this or dealing with this. And then it was to try and understand, I think, the extent, like the stakeholder network. So who is who in the zoo, and the level of trust, I think, between you as policy professionals and those particular stakeholder groups. Are they a trusted, useful peak body who provide good advice, or do they have a particular perspective on certain things that we need to be aware of, which is why they provide input in a particular way or have a different particular perspective. So yeah, the incoming brief, the paperwork was useful, but equally was the discussions with leads, and not just senior level, but really different. I mean, all elements of policy development, from the people that are on the ground all the way through the development of that. So I then digested all of that and then played all of that back to the senior leadership to help them understand what I had heard. And then we could kind of align that, and they then understood, well, what actually we meant was this, and then it allowed us to kind of refine that. I hope that kind of answered your question.
Thank you. Yes, it did. Yeah.
And we're also going to hear a follow-up question from Chanel now about the way that you prepare for Cabinet. So Chanel, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I work in the Cabinet team, Minister, and my question is actually about Cabinet convention. Given it runs on convention and our role is to support Cabinet to be as informed and the process to be as transparent as possible, do you have a view on how a Cabinet process could be improved?
It's a very good question. And I think so I did a course, Advanced Political Leadership course, that was run by the McKinnon Institute and Monash University. And it was great for two reasons. One, it was a really good example of professional development being provided to potential ministers and existing MPs. And during that course, we had the privilege of hearing from former state and federal cabinet ministers. And it was a former Victorian cabinet minister who, because I guess one step back to other, unless you're in cabinet, you equally as a member of parliament understand only a certain degree of how it operates. There is a black box element to it. So it was really useful to have these discussions. And one of the bits of feedback was you need to take an active interest in your other cabinet ministers' agenda, because that is the function of Westminster system and cabinet. You are required to have a input and a view and challenge other people's perspectives to deliver a better outcome and decision deliberation process. So what helps with that is time, being able to digest the cabinet submissions and really understand and read and get your head around it. Now, for good reason sometimes, and just purely for time pressures, you know, we won't see, we won't get a great depth of information up until, you know, the Friday of, which means you're reading and consuming and making phone calls over the weekend. So a bit more time could be useful, but that's, you know, that there's not a single answer to that. But I think also really, and I've seen this in working quite well, is the interplay, or highlighting the interplay between a decision in health and that on environment, or different portfolios, and how where the relationship and the impact might be. Because the last thing you want is an unintended consequence or a perverse outcome because a decision has been made in isolation, and perhaps there wasn't clear visibility on how this will actually impact the work of a particular minister's responsibility or spot. So that, and just clear language, I think, is the other critical part. It's really consistency in how things are provided and delivered is equally really important, because you're trying to consume a lot of in-depth information very quickly.
Thank you.
And Sudesh has a question about balancing policy decisions and the different elements. Sudesh, would you like to come and ask your question?
Hi, Minister, thanks. Just wanted to get an understanding about how you manage or balance a policy decision about land and environment, where the electorate expectation is in direct conflict with scientific evidence, and which may lead to adverse outcomes for the environment. And how do you communicate that out to the general public?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think environment is one area where this has been and has been for a long time a constant challenge, but equally you could apply this to a variety of different portfolio areas. At the end of the day, the expectation is that decisions are guided by science, and that is what the community would expect, and that is what I think we as policy professionals would expect as well. But sometimes there are unavoidable impacts as a result of, let's take, for example, the growth of Greater Sydney and the setting in which that work is being undertaken. And you need to make the best decision you possibly can, giving consideration to the other pressures that we're under here. So from a planning perspective, a housing affordability issue, a growth perspective, my expectation would be looking at something like the Cumberland Plain Conservation Plan, which is a terrific piece of work which brings together all of those disparate issues, but provides a great strategic planning instrument and plan. That's a great example of where you've managed to mitigate impact on environment, brought together some great policy instruments and outcomes, and made the best of what is a challenging situation. So then you've got to go out there, and I went out there a couple of weeks ago to meet communities in that particular area, to hear from them, some who are incredibly impressed and proud of the conservation outcomes, and others who still have issues with what's happened from a zoning perspective, for example. But big policy creates conflict and change and challenges sometimes, and that is a key part and function of the minister and the government, is to go out there and then meet and understand and communicate and hear, how has this impacted you? How can we improve? What can we do better? How can we fix it up? So I guess by virtue of making decisions, you're going to end up with conflict at some point. But ultimately, if it's for the greater good and driven by science, then you're in the best position possible to have landed on that outcome.
Thank you. Now we have a question. We are going to go a little bit into some content, so just giving you some advance warning. We've got, I think, air and waste issues coming up, and Nicola has popped in to ask a question.
Hi, my name's Nicola. I'm from the EPA. I was just wondering what your opinion is on developing a domestic remanufacturing market in New South Wales as our perspective on waste changes.
Yep, great question, and let's do it yesterday. I had a meeting with Red Cycle yesterday, and for those of you, hopefully everybody's been following that, with the challenges around the collection and remanufacturing, essentially, of soft plastics. There's such a phenomenal opportunity when it comes to standing up advanced remanufacturing industry in New South Wales to deal with waste. I think if you look at the model of return and earn, and the fact that we've stood up the plant down in Albury, which is the biggest plastic recycling facility in the country, is a great example of where government, industry, and other stakeholders have come together to recognise an issue and then deliver a really smart outcome, and stood up a wonderful piece of infrastructure that is very impressive. So there's a great opportunity to evolve and see, and through our waste and sustainable materials strategy, which you'll know well, to see waste as a commodity and actually identify how that can then be used to turbocharge a manufacturing industry in New South Wales, as well as creating jobs, all while delivering a great environmental outcome. So the challenge there is basically the value chain. So you've got the brand owner and the producer at one end, who have the product stewardship and a responsibility, the consumer, the collection issue, and then basically the recycling element. And lining all of that up, the last critical piece is the offtake. So who is purchasing, and is there a market for the pellets and the plastic that and the resin or whatever the output is? I think we're nearly there at that last bit. And to my earlier point around using a point in time or having a catalyst for policy change, the Red Cycle issue has accelerated the discussions to try and deliver an outcome sooner rather than later. Then you've then got the other challenge of a lot of chefs in the kitchen at the moment. There's a national approach, there's various peak bodies, there's industry. It's just about coalescing them all together and determining what the immediate next step is, which I think we're pretty close to doing. Thanks,
Thank
Nicola.
you. And sorry, I was wrong about air. It was actually noise. Will, would you like to come on and ask your question about noise?
Yeah, g'day. Hi, Minister. Quick question from me about noise. I reckon it's a pretty important factor, sort of impacting people's experience of the environment around them, whether it's like their house or where they work or where they want to spend leisure time. And particularly in cities, I think vehicles are sort of a real source of the noise that is impacting and limiting people's satisfaction with the environments around them. But when I look at what New South Wales is doing, it doesn't seem as sort of cutting edge or sort of boundary pushing as what other jurisdictions are doing. So Paris and New York and other places like that are trialling things like automated noise enforcement for vehicles. Obviously, that's something that would be a major change, in that many people take a lot of pride in making their vehicle as loud as it can possibly be and the like. So it would go against what many people's experience of road transport is in Australia and in New South Wales and in Sydney. But do you reckon there could be any appetite or any interest for anything like that? I haven't seen any references to anything like that in future transport, for example.
Yeah, thanks, Will. And like two interesting touch points for you. One with the local MP hat on. You would probably be surprised at the amount of letters I get where people are annoyed at the exhaust pipe of a motorbike or being woken by a loud car going past. And then with the minister hat on, the role of the EPA and kind of the limitations that we face in enforcing and dealing with those issues and noise issues. I think the other element as well, which again is going back to that macro level, I don't know if you all recall, maybe it was just me being slightly crazy over there in Manly, but during COVID, when everything just stopped, how quiet it was in your neighborhoods and in your local parks. And I think that's a great example of where COVID, for as terrible as it has been, has actually created some opportunities to have discussions that we would not have been having previously, because there was no reference point, because it was just, we were all living life. So I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but post that, the amount of correspondence from constituents around vehicle noise post-COVID kind of increased, because as life got back to normal, things, they realized that actually it was a lot quieter before. So I had no idea about the automated noise thing in Paris. But, these are the sorts, if that's something you've seen, then maybe that's a discussion that you start internally about, this is happening, is there a discussion about this that needs to be had? And then that is, I guess, a great way of formulating and considering how policy can be made. It's ideas, it's thoughts, it's looking elsewhere to understand what's possibly happening, that can then jog a discussion and get it going. But yeah, hopefully I've kind of answered that in some way.
And thank you, Will, for a great example of how to ask a question and pitch a policy idea. So it's great to see that in action. Now, Stuart is going to, I think we're turning to Stuart next. He's going to ask a question on clearing, I think, and how to address that issue. Stuart, would you like to come on?
Yeah, sorry, I don't seem to have a camera.
That's fine.
Really, just how do you deal with conflicting values? And that must be a constant problem in the environment portfolio. But for example, government commitments to building housing and clearing land for farming or infrastructure projects, but generally private land clearing, as opposed to, we've got a public estate, not so interested in that. But what can we do that helps you go into those kind of conflicting value discussions, which must be pretty constant?
Yeah, it's a good one, and again goes back to the early briefings on becoming the minister, and then one of the first things that we committed to doing was getting the State of the Environment report out in New South Wales, and that set the framework for what, in part, set the framework and the agenda for the challenges that I was going to deal with. Land clearing is an obvious one. it is undeniable in the State of the Environment report that that is an issue. And the other factor to dealing with this is it's all well and good for people to say, you know, expand the national park estate, and if we could cover everything, that would be great, but we can't, because 70% of New South Wales or thereabouts is held in private ownership, and that ranges from your hobby farmers through to medium-sized, through to you know, your large corporations that have farming and ag industry. So then looking at what policy levers are available, and that's where the Biodiversity Conservation Trust really came to the fore in saying, well, we can drive behavioural change with landowners by helping them understand that they can be incentivised for good conservation outcomes on their land, and the biodiversity offset scheme plays a central role in doing that. So there is a dual approach here, one of regulation and one of incentivisation to do better conservation and deliver better land management practices. Central to that has been a very forthright relationship with the New South Wales farmers, because I want to understand their view and their perspective in terms of our discussion around land use and the conflict and the challenges that are presented there. So it goes back to really getting and having strong relationships with stakeholders, not necessarily those that are supportive of your views, but those that do not support it, and understand why that is the case and where are particular points of alignment, and then working from there. Because once you can land on, okay, there is a point of agreement here, let's build from that, rather than set positions of, look, we disagree or have a differing view, then you can start to have a decent discussion. And that's where the sustainable farming program kind of evolved from, in terms of helping landowners understand that if you plant trees, do conservation work, do fencing, all the rest of it, then government can incentivise and support you to do that. And that is an education process, both for colleagues in Cabinet, members of Parliament and communities. And that takes, you know, reforms are hard won. It takes effort. And if it fundamentally you believe it's the right thing to do, it aligns with your values and stacks up with the data, then you can win. But it takes a lot of work, and it takes talking to people that don't share your view. So that's what a lot of time has been spent in really trying to deliver those outcomes, to shift and arrest that trajectory of land clearing. So Stuart, I hope that in some way answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And we have done a bit of a dive into environment-specific topics, and we're now going to make our way back to issues across the New South Wales Government. So Greer has a great linking question to get there. Greer, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Thanks, Louisa. Good morning, Minister. I just wanted to ask, we're all policy professionals from different government departments. Obviously, here today we've got over 300. How do you think New South Wales is going in terms of a united public policy approach to our key environmental issues, given that we all have different remits?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Greer, and thank you. I think through the hard work of probably many of the people on this call, there has been a good threading of environmental and energy policy across government. And you think of the big structural pieces, the net zero plan, for example, which has been driven and really, I think, understood quite well by many different government agencies and sectors. And you see that whether it's in transport, in health, in the recent announcement around solar for schools. So I think we policy professionals, as well as the executive government, have done a good job in really aligning and getting some coordination that is delivering some really good outcomes. I also think, putting my local MP hat on, that's reflected in the community. I stood on a street corner in Freshwater last week, as a local MP does, and some really good feedback from community members about what the government is doing in terms of its approach to net zero and the environment. So I think over time, you know, I liken it to sort of turning a cruise ship around. It takes a lot of time, it moves slowly, but when it happens, it happens. And I think there's some great examples where, whether it's circular economy, waste management, in procurement, for example, local government sector, you know, road base using recycled glass. There's a lot of good work that's being done. Sometimes I think things get stuck because of how big an entity government is. So there could be a bit more agility there. But you know, we could all work a bit quicker and smarter from time to time. But yeah, so hopefully that's answered your question.
Thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned local government because Claire has a question.
Good morning, Minister. Claire Higgins from the Environment Protection Authority. My question is around disaster risk reduction, noting that it stems from strategic infrastructure planning that mitigates future hazards. And I'm wondering how we can better support our local governments so planning mechanisms and decisions are robust at every level of governance and policy.
That's a good one. And I think you know, local government are our partners in so much delivery across government, and that's particularly being felt when it comes to disaster and climate adaptation and the pressures that are being placed on them from an infrastructure perspective. I recall a couple of years ago, the Northern Beaches Council received a grant from the state government to do some floodplain, some flood studies. And this was pre-floods, and I remember thinking, it's interesting. Like I didn't think that would necessarily be such an important piece of policy kit or documentation for them to do, but it has obviously proven to be a very important and useful study that they did back then. I think we're at a point now where we are delivering with the immediate kind of cleanup and the flood inquiry recommendations and the work that's being done there, the whole of government response. But to help local government really understand and provide them with the resources that they need in terms of adaptation or new building or infrastructure builds to deal with these increased disasters, environmental climate disasters, as we're going to face into the future, is really important. Obviously, they've got rate-based pressures. There's a lot asked of them. So I think even if it is just supporting them with in-kind technical expertise, that is as welcome as a grant funding opportunity. But again, I think open dialogue with councils is critically important to delivering that, because this is only going to get even more challenging in the years ahead.
Thanks, Minister.
Now, we've touched on local government. So I know you've had a few opportunities on the interjurisdictional level recently. So I think we have a question from Rebecca on that. Rebecca, would you like to turn your camera on? Hi.
Hello, good morning. My name is Rebecca. I'm from the New South Wales EPA. As you can probably see from behind me, I work in the plastics team. My question for you is, as one of the larger populations or economies within Australia, New South Wales is often called upon to be a leader in national issues. So interested in your thoughts around how we navigate that relationship with other governments, such as the Commonwealth, when we may have competing policy views on issues that are of national significance.
That's a great question, and yes, very good background. Stop it and swap it, and well done, and a great example. We've banned single-use plastic bags in June, more single-use plastic items in November, and a great opportunity for a really bold next couple of steps. We had the National Environment Ministers meeting a few weeks ago, and that was the first time in more than 500 days that we had all come together, all the states, the territories, and the federal minister. New South Wales called for that meeting, and so by virtue of doing that, demonstrated that we're putting our hand up well, it was actually me, but put hand up to say, look, let's get together and have a discussion about these pressing issues and what are we going to do to deal with it. That was a really, really fruitful meeting. And I think as policy professionals, to have a look at the communique that was published at the conclusion of that meeting gives a really good insight into basically how the work that led up to that, the actual meeting itself, the agreement in the room amongst the ministers from different jurisdictions, and then the output to send a signal to citizens, to the media, to all stakeholders, and also governments of this is where we are going to head. 99% of it was a unanimous perspective, with one or two issues, some states feeling a little bit uncomfortable based on their domestic policy positions. But I think given that we are the most populous state, we do have an opportunity and an obligation to lead and to be bold and to put our hand up and say, yes, we can and we will seek to achieve this particular outcome in whatever area it might be. And other states respond well to that because they begrudgingly do respect that we are the biggest, and therefore we have a responsibility that does come with that. So the more we can frame up and work collaboratively, the better. But at the same time, it does take someone to lead. It does take someone to go first. And where we can, that is a really encouraged view. I don't want to speak for other ministers, but for myself, certainly, to try and do that. Now, that also does take a collaboration and obviously you need to get that position through cabinet. And that is where the background work by policy professionals comes really to the fore, so we can present the most compelling argument as to why we should go and do this particular or pursue this particular policy outcome. Okay, on mute, Louisa.
Everyone has to do it once in a meeting, right?
That's right.
We have a question from Oscar. Oscar, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Yeah, sure, thanks. So I've actually plagiarized this question from a previous one directed at Georgina Harrison, the Secretary of Education. But Minister, you mentioned earlier that big policy creates challenges and change. Do you think that opportunities for those big disruptive reforms only come along once in a while, like at the start of a government's term, or can they be seized whenever?
I think they can be seized whenever because they're often as a result of a number of factors, and something in the world or in a local community or in a state may happen which catalyzes the need for significant reform, and you never know what that will be or when that will happen. And I think that there are windows of opportunity that open after that incident or issue or whatever it may be happens, that you need to kind of run through and grab. So therefore, you've got a pretty broad time frame in which to do it. Now, obviously, we're heading into caretaker, and the time for something like that is slim. But good policy is not cyclical in its nature. It is a constant, and I think at every point. I mean, I became a minister a year ago, and I was hungry and still am for what's the big stuff that we can do that's really going to make a profound change, as well as getting the small things right and doing the business as usual correctly. So I think because of external factors, there is always an opportunity for significant reform, but a lot of it requires getting the key stakeholders on board, and that takes time. So, really having an understanding of what supporters of reform are saying and why, but equally detractors of it, sitting down with them and saying, look, what's going on? Why do you feel this particular way? And trying to navigate a pathway through that is difficult, but it's needed. So yeah, I don't think there's a particular time. I think it can be done at any point, really.
Thank you.
And thank you, Georgie, for your note about Kingdon's multiple streams theory for policy theorists, identifying those windows when there's an alignment of the political, the practical, and stakeholders, I think is the third thing. But there are many things that need to come together for a policy window to emerge. Now, I have a question to help us, the public sector, improve, and I think there is something that we can learn from MPs and ministers in relation to stakeholder engagement. So often I think, you know, we're very focused on inward focusing issues and, you know, doing the best job that we can in terms of providing policy advice. But I think, can you perhaps pass on your top tips to us for what the public sector can learn from ministers and MPs in terms of stakeholder engagement?
Well, I think my starting point would be not to be scared of it, and actually see it as an asset in terms of development of policy, whether it's in its formative stages or more mature in its thinking. And stakeholders can make life easy in terms of delivering policy outcomes, or incredibly challenging. In the confidence of this meeting, one particular stakeholder meeting that I had with the EPA was one that really springs to mind, and that was meeting with the bushfire survivors group, who had previously, with the Environmental Defender's Office, taken the EPA or the government to court about its role in terms of climate change policy. The bushfire survivors were not professional lobbyists. These were people who had been impacted by bushfires, and they were nervous. They were very authentic, and they wanted to share their view and why they felt it was incredibly important that we delivered this, or put our minds to the climate change policy work. And so the easier decision would have been they had a meeting request in. The easy one would have been to say, no, won't take it. Look, we're working through a process. There's an official consultation period. Please, you know, use that. Please use the website. But I took the meeting, had the EPA there as well, and allowed them to just share their views at a human level, to really understand, help them appreciate that we understood as a government and an agency that their concerns were valid and real, and that we were committed to working on this for them and working alongside them, and then helped change or move that meeting to empower them as stakeholders to help us move this policy along. And in doing that, be making constructive contributions to the discussion, and sharing their views and what we were trying to do with their network, and have a multiplier effect really of what we were attempting to do. So that was a great example, I think, of meeting with the stakeholder group at a human level, understanding why they were invested in this particular issue, and then sharing with them where we're up to, and within reason, and then moving from there. So I'd say, you know, stakeholders, some of them are very fixed in their ways, but others it's worthwhile meeting with, just really to understand and help them understand that you are listening, and that you will try your best to have their view inform what it is that the policy is seeking to deliver.
Yeah, definitely some good tips there for us to remember going forward. Now, I just have one quick finishing up question before we close today, and I think it's a good one to end on. It's been a busy year for you and for all of us in the public sector as well, and I thought I'd ask, how are you staying calm and focused towards the end of the year?
Well, some people would say it's kind of not a very fun thing to do, but I like going running. It gets me into a good mental space and is a good clearinghouse for thoughts and processes. I've got a 4-year-old boy who's he's 3 and a bit, and he's turning 4 in December. We're having a pirate party, so I'm very excited about that. And a 2.5-year-old girl. So it's busy time with family. But you know, we've all, I think, worked incredibly hard this year, and you know, I'm not sure how many of them are on the call, but I want to express my gratitude and thanks to the team at Environment and Heritage Group, and you know, they have done a terrific job, and I'm incredibly proud of the work that they as public servants and policy professionals do and deliver. And I think that, you know, wherever you are in government, we all have an opportunity to make a contribution, and for some of us it will be a brief moment in time. For others it's a long period of time, but it's a privilege to do it. And I think, you know, my frame of mind when it comes to pressure is that it's a privilege, because you could just do a job, a 9-to-5 thing that, you know, you went along with. But if pressure comes into your working day, then, you know, it's because you've got a decision to make or something to do that is of impact. So I want to thank you all so much for what you've done, and I really appreciate the professionalism and the energy and effort that many of you have delivered to make the lives of our citizens as best as they possibly can be.
Thank you. And on behalf of the community of policy professionals, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us today, and thank also our audience for your interest and enthusiasm in policy. And don't forget to respond to our feedback form as well. And we'll be back again next year in February with Kate Boyd, General Counsel from the Department of Premier and Cabinet, to discuss elections and caretaker conventions. So look forward to that one, and I hope you all enjoy a relaxing break. Until then, take care. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.